All right, so I've been in the Christian apologetics spaces on the internet for a while now. At least I'm not now, and in particular, I've been in the Black Christian apologetics circles, namely dealing with the conscious community, so to speak, the Black Hebrew Israelites, people in that particular sphere who take a more race conscious approach to being skeptical about the validity of Christianity. And one of the things that you tend to hear a lot is this idea that Christianity is the white man's religion. You hear it a lot. You hear it a lot. I mean, maybe not as much because I'm not really in those circles anymore. But I've heard it a lot when I was occupying those circles. So here's the thing that I wanna urge, because I just saw a post on Facebook from a black guy. I don't know who he is. He's just this random guy. It went viral. The post went viral, and he basically says to all of those persons who believe that Christianity is the white man's religion, just look at how many of those in the early church were black. And then he starts naming a lot of these North African fathers and these North African writers that obviously come from Africa. So it's absolutely the case that there's clear evidence that that Christianity is in Africa, like centuries, and I mean centuries and centuries before the transatlantic slave trade happens. Like even Alexandria, Egypt, that's clearly in Africa. Alexandria is actually one of the pentarchies, one of the patriarchates in the early church. They held power. They held actual jurisdictional power in the early church because they claimed apostolic succession. So it's clearly the case that there is African presence in the early church for sure. The claim, however, though, by Christian apologists, by some of them, and by this guy, and this is how they argue it. They basically make the claim that Christianity is in Africa, and then make the claim, and then argue from just by quoting certain of these persons that are in the early church that come from Africa. They basically say, well, and not only is Christianity in Africa, you have people like Origen, you have people like Augustine, you have people like Athanasius, you have like all these guys, and then they will make the leap, and it's not a logical leap. It doesn't logically follow, but they'll make the leap that these particular persons are therefore black because they were born in Africa. That is the thing that I want to urge us to be a little bit more careful about, because that is a very shaky claim on very shaky foundation. If you know anything about North Africa in particular, specifically like Egypt, and this is where Alexandria is, and this probably stems from like an ignorance of like of anthropological and genetic research that has come out in the past couple of years. It's been out for a while about modern day Egypt, about actually ancient Egyptians. Ancient Egyptians have more in common with modern day Palestinians than they do with sub-Saharan Africans. And you have to also understand that Alexandria in the first century, at least in the second century as well, and third century, it's a highly Hellenized region, meaning that it's literally Greek. It's a Greek mixed Palestinian population. 9 times out of 10, most persons that occupy there. Obviously, I'm not saying that there were no sub-Saharan Africans in the first or second century that occupied North Africa. Obviously, I'm not saying that. You have Ethiopia. Well, I'm not. Well, Ethiopia actually became Christianized way after the first century and everything like that. You can make the claim that Ethiopia became Christianized way before the transatlantic slave trade. So that is one thing that you could possibly say. But it doesn't really help because most black people like me, we are probably of West African ancestry. So I don't think our ancestors were exposed to Christianity by that time. But the thing is that these particular persons in the early church, these early church fathers, they likely were Mediterranean or Palestinian descent. They likely didn't look like us. They likely looked like modern day Palestinians, or how Greek, or more so like brown skinned Greeks would look, like how Greek people look now. just a little bit more brown skinned. That's probably how they looked in these environments and in these regions. So it's not really the case that you can say that Christianity is thoroughly subsumed by African peoples in the early centuries of the church. I just don't think the history bears that out. Now there is one that I can point to, which is Moses the Ethiopian. Some people call him Moses the Black. He's actually venerated in Roman Catholicism and in the Eastern Orthodox Church. He's clearly a black man. He's one of the Desert Fathers. So these are the persons who spurred on the movement of monasticism. He's clearly there. He's clearly a black guy. But it's not really, you can't really make the claim that all of these other persons that you see that come from Africa, they're necessarily black. It doesn't follow. And I think even if you take into consideration like certain anthropological evidence and even genetic evidence, just looking at the history of it, I don't think you can reasonably say that the persons that occupied those particular places in North Africa and things like that, they were predominantly of sub-Saharan African ancestry. Maybe there were some there, but I don't think predominantly you can say that at all. So so if we're trying to combat this false claim that Christianity is the right white man's religion, I think we need to do a better job at articulating the reasons why we can say that. And I think it needs to be more so, if we're just going to say, if somebody's making a claim Christianity wasn't in Africa at all until recently, and then you could probably start saying these people may not be black, but Christianity is clearly in Africa. You can just look at Origin, you can look at all of these other people. You could probably say that. You can even and obviously look at Ethiopia, when Ethiopia became Christianized. So sure, you can make those kinds of claims, but you have to be making those kinds of claims that is consistent with the evidence on the ground. You can't just make the claim and just assume that these persons are black. It's not really, like, it's very hard to make that argument. And I think a lot of people are catching on to that. But I do know that a lot of black Christians still do that, especially a lot of black Christians that are getting into early church history and things like that, which is great. It's absolutely great. But we just got to be a lot more careful with combating the black skeptic community and actually be honest and be careful about the claims that we make. So I think that's the one thing that I want to talk about. We got to be careful about certain claims about church history in relation to black ancestry and things like that, because it's definitely not the case that these persons, I wouldn't even say definitely not the case, it's more likely than not the case that these persons were not of an African ancestry. And that's just what it is. So we just got to be a lot more careful about that type of stuff. All right, peace.